I started off in this area as a biologist. I studied at Pepperdine, I studied biology, and particularly tried to understand how my faith intersected with biology. I went to a church that unfortunately told me I was going to hell for going to Pepperdine, and then told me I was going to hell for studying biology. So that was my starting point for understanding what science was. And then when I got to Pepperdine, and all my biology professors were with me in church, and we all talked about faith issues. It was a very transformative kind of moment to think that maybe biology had something to say about God, what God was doing on this planet, and that my study of it alongside of some of my most formative mentors was trying to understand what God was doing on this planet through that particular form of thought. And then I went away for a while to get a master's degree. I stayed at Pepperdine for a bit, and then went to Berkeley to get a PhD, and I studied the intersection of faith and science in particular. And about 2006, 2007, I started doing some classes on the intersection of biology and ecology in particular, so how ecosystems work and why Christians in particular were not always interested in thinking about why ecosystems were working and the conservation of ecosystems. And then for there, it got me into more climate work. And what I found is the more that I was talking about how our planet was impacted by climate issues and why Christians should be on the front edge of this but have not, the more that I found my students were interested in hearing what I had to say. So it was very fascinating. So I started at the kind of the end of the 2007 year, so millennials, and now I'm into teaching the Gen Z generation. And I think there's a piece of this that I find really fascinating is that at least some of the research shows that Christians, that are young Christians who lose their faith, that not being able to understand why Christians are so opposed oftentimes to doing conservation work or doing climate work is one of the top 10 reasons or so that young people under the age of 30 leave the church. I always tell students leaving the church is often done for many reasons. I don't think there's ever a single reason why that happens, but that could be, in many faith stories, a straw that breaks the proverbial camel's back. And so I always find it very interesting that when I teach this class or versions of this class, my non-Christian students often tell me stories of leaving the church. And if only someone was like you talking in our churches, maybe I would have given this Christianity thing more of a shot. And I think there's something for us all to think about, because the story of protecting and preserving and working with God's creation goes back 2,000 years and goes back into the Jewish tradition much further than that. And unfortunately, it's that kind of work has gotten tied up in a lot of other things. But I try to untie some of those knots, and then I try to kind of retie some things for some students into things that I know they take seriously. I always like to say Gen Zers didn't just sort of evolutionarily come about out of nowhere, that they are asking the same perennial questions that we are all asking. Is there purpose in the world? What am I supposed to be doing? Should I have kids or not? All of those things are perennial questions that the Christian story has been challenged with and dealing with for 2,000 years. And I'm just happy to be alongside working with students that are really looking for those things, even though they sometimes frustrate us old people and to not wanting to answer them the ways that we want. But I think they're searching honestly for those answers and are really profoundly moved by people who can be authentic and transparent, and they are completely dissuaded by people who seem like they're not giving them honest answers. And I find that to be a really fun thing to work with this group.
Yeah, thank you. Chris has written a book, and I will do a plug for the book because I don't think that's the kind of person Chris is, that he would plug his own book. It's called Hope in the Age of Climate Change. And one of the things that I really appreciate about the book is that you are so deep in Scripture in terms of how you're connecting to these very contemporary issues. And I think that's not something we hear a lot. Obviously, the scientific community is coming at things from a scientific perspective. The media has their own way of telling the stories. But to have a look at these issues that is really, really rooted in Scripture and in faith, I think I found it very refreshing and interesting. So what are some of the places where you go in Scripture or in the faith tradition that are really evocative for you as you think about some of these issues?
Yeah, I think, thank you for the plug.
You're welcome.
The first two chapters are deep dives into both the Old Testament and the New Testament to look at two significant themes. First, why is God the creator? And looking at a lot of passages that talk about what it means for God to create, and what does that mean when God cares for something that God creates. And then the second chapter is God the Redeemer, and that looks at a lot of the stories in Scripture that talk about redemption. And so one of the things that I found really fascinating is there's a whole new kind of genre of research in the last 15 or so years that how the Old Testament prophets in particular were looking at the intersection of how the land was treated and how dispossessed and poor and marginalized people in those lands were treated. And that the ancient Israelite wisdom was really this real key kind of insight into who the Israelites were, and they oftentimes connected very, very profoundly. If you were treating the land well, you were often treating the poor in that land well, and vice versa. If you were not treating the land well, you were often not treating the poor well. And seeing Hosea and Amos and others talk about that was really transformative for my own personal faith to see that seems to be a part of this ancient Israelite tradition. And secondly, put alongside of that those Old Testament prophets oftentimes said God alongside of the animals or the birds of the air and the creatures of the ground were judging humans for not keeping up their end of the deal. So you have this kind of panoply kind of description, it's in the Psalms as well, of sort of all the creatures doing what they're supposed to be doing, and human beings are the ones who are violent and basically are the ones who flip off God. But everything else is doing its job. And Hosea and Amos kind of point to that and say, God chooses those animals to judge us for our unrighteousness. And as a former biologist, I found that very moving to kind of think about what does it mean to play the role in creation that I'm supposed to play, and that the ancient insight was that everything else was playing its role except us. We were the violent ones. We were the ones that could commit genocide. We were the ones that can commit ecocide. Animals are just doing their thing and praising God. We are the ones that tend to reject that. And another one from the New Testament that I found really moving for me personally, especially someone who studied ancient or Koine Greek, in the passage in Colossians when Paul talks about all things being made through Christ and by Christ and will be reconciled to Christ, that Greek term all really points to everything and not just the human things of the story. And I found that to be really transformative for my own faith, again, because so much of my Christian walk growing up was very human or anthropocentric, so very centered on this salvation story is only impacting me personally or other humans in the story. In Colossians and then Romans and a couple other places in the New Testament, but Colossians in particular, sort of reframes that in a way, and Paul says, no, everything is under the lordship of Christ, and everything is going to be reconciled through Christ. And to me, again, as a biologist, it made a lot of sense, because I'd like to think that everything that God creates has a place in the story for this last 4 billion or so years on this planet, and the 13 or so billion light years of the entire universe. Everything has a role. And that to me is very moving to think that the story of creation is far bigger than just me and my own personal sin, but that the cosmic redemption of Christ spans the entirety of the universe. To me is something that I find really moving, not just for my personal faith, but also my intersection of just who I am as a biologist.
Yeah, thanks. I really appreciate that. It was making me think about the creation story in Genesis 1, that before people even come along, there are 5 days of creation of God making things and saying all of these things are good. So then, why would God's sort of redemptive intention only apply to human beings and not to the rest of creation? I really like that. So then how does this begin to come home for people living in the 21st century, trying to buy groceries and commute to work and all the stuff that we all have to live with?
Yeah, it's the worst, as my students would say. They're fond of superlatives. Part of what climate change is teaching us, if we want to use that as a personified metaphor, is that the standard of living that most of us have been born into and just accept as our normal, everyday kind of American lifestyle is so carbon intensive that it cannot really support the entire planet. Meaning there's not many of us that could live the way So I think one of the most recent estimates was that there could be, if we all lived like Americans on this planet, there could only be about 1 billion people living on the planet with current day technology. That's how carbon intensive that we are as Americans. But I don't think any of us wake up in the morning and go, you know what, I just want to like screw over those people in Bangladesh or in India or fill in the blank place around the equator where climate change is impacting greatly. But we're born into a system wherein lots of decisions were made before us and we're benefiting from them disproportionately. And so one of the things that I kind of think about is taking a step back is grace was not talked about a lot in my particular tradition growing up, so I'm happy to be in a Lutheran setting.
We love grace.
Where grace
we love
is a big
grace.
deal. And I think there's something about, as I tell my students when I pray before bedtime, to think about praying for the forgiveness for those sins of commission that I know I've done, the sins of omission when I know I should have done something differently, but also the sins of ignorance. And those oftentimes I think are the kind of environmental sins or the climate sins, as it were, that we commit, in that we are just living our lives, but our lives are interdependently connected with the rest of the ecosystems and the rest of the humans on the planet. We can no longer feign ignorance and say, what we do here doesn't impact the rest of the world. We just know that that's the case, whether it's buying clothes from another nation, whether it's buying gas that comes from another nation, whether it's buying food, maybe that was at your potluck earlier, that comes from another nation. We are all interdependently linked. And I think there's something about that there's a sort of awakening moment in a bad way sometimes where we feel like an immense amount of guilt. And as I talk about in the book, I think guilt is a healthy reminder that we have a moral compass, but it is not much more than that, because guilt doesn't often lead us to a good, healthy life. It's a very good short-term motivator, but it's not a good long-term motivator. And so what I think is so important in the Christian story is to acknowledge that we are disproportionately benefited by lots of things that our standard of living gives us, but have to think about carefully what would repentance look like in that mode of sort of accepting that this reality does not necessarily be something we've chosen, and then how do we understand that for others. And so for me, that's where grace kind of fits into this a lot, is not saying I should let myself off the hook, but to realize I'm one of 8.1 or so billion people on this planet, and how I think about my relationship to God should at least try to get away from ignorance as much as possible and accept some hard realities for what they are, but not be ignorant to the fact that my one action, I drove a fossil fuel car to come over here to talk to you all. I don't think that's like the worst thing I've ever done in my life, but I have to admit that for what it is, that there is a piece of everything that we do that supports a particular type of lifestyle. And that in itself, I think, is a good admission for us as Christians to do, because when we admit truths like that, then we can figure out creative solutions to go in other directions going forward.
Yeah. When I start to reflect on these things, I very quickly feel overwhelmed because everything is so interconnected. And it's like if I pull on one thread, everything is going to get shaken. But what I hear you saying is, we can't choose not to think about it. Or maybe we can, but we ought not to choose not to think about it. And that because of all this interconnectedness, that has a bearing on what our faith teaches us. That we're not, islands unto ourselves. That we're not individual humans who I can do what I want and I'm not hurting anybody, and like my actions don't have consequences outside myself. Like, we just know that not to be true. So how do you start to make some tangible kind of choices in light of that interconnectedness?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's one I get frequently. I think there's a certain kind of analysis we have to do of our own lives and where we're at in our lives and where we live. And so I'll just give a couple examples in my own life. I have about a 3 by 20 piece of ground in my backyard that is my quote unquote garden, right? And can I grow enough to live on? No. But can I grow enough to kind of understand that gardening and farming is a really hard, humbling thing? Yes, absolutely. And every time I fail at something, growing a tomato, or I still can't get watermelons to grow in Malibu, but if all those things, those failures, I can go to the grocery store and kind of correct my mistakes, or I can go to one of my friends who is a farmer and correct my mistakes. But thinking through even something like that, I can become more mindful of the fact that, like, lots of other people don't have access to fresh produce. Lots of other people in places where cantaloupes are growing, and say Mexico is probably one of our leading importer. We import so many tons of fresh fruit from Mexico. The drought in Mexico and the climate change impacts on Mexico are changing the way that we are going to get produce here in the States. So to me, even just doing something like growing, even I tell my students, growing one plant and kind of thinking about the reflection that we can do and the mindfulness that we can kind of start to imbue in ourselves can help us think about how those connect to other things. And so that's changed my eating habits. I'm mostly vegetarian. I only eat meat very seldomly because of its climate impacts and its impacts on people of color, especially in communities of color where slaughterhouses are oftentimes spewing effluent and other kinds of materials into the air. There's just lots of pieces that I think if we start in one place, we can connect a lot of dots in other places. And that gets me, at least, to start thinking about what I tell my students. Christianity is the worst religion because everything counts. Like, we don't get to say something is in and something is out. And so, you know, as much of the time as my students say, like, well, why don't you talk about abortion or this or that? When I start talking about food and why that has a moral connotation for me, they see a sort of transparency about, like, it's not just hot-button issues that Christians should be concerned about if they're saying the lordship of Christ is over all things. And so I need to think about those things. So again, I start with food oftentimes. I don't have, for me, transportation is something that, like, I don't fly a lot just because I don't like to fly a lot. So that's not one I deal with all that much. But I eat, just like everyone else eats. And then I have a chapter on how the Eucharist, I'm not sure what you guys call the Eucharist in your tradition, how the bread and the wine are these really deep, rich symbols of Christian heritage, but they literally start out in the fields. And what does that mean for us to think about how they start out in the fields, and what does it mean for either mechanized labor or actual labor to pick those things? What does it mean for people to imbibe things or eat things that comes from either toxic pesticide-related grounds or not? So those are some of the things I get from gardening, just from that alone. The other thing that I get is a little bit off of what you were talking about, but I'm a scuba diver. I've been diving since I was in high school. Seeing the damage of the human condition underwater, to me, is a pretty dramatic kind of thing. Just a couple of years ago, we had some of this really interesting submarine photos of candy wrappers 7 miles deep on the bottom of the ocean. And it's really kind of a perverse kind of sense of what humanity is when you start thinking about how the impact is on the entire planet. So again, one of my favorite activities now, I try to be mindful about, like, how is that activity impacting it? As I say in the beginning of the book, there's sort of my Job whirlwind moment. When I'm underwater, I see things that are just reminding me of God in a much different way. But I also see the impact of humans in the last 400 years or so in the Industrial Revolution that's leading to candy wrappers being 7 miles deep in the ocean. And that makes me think again about, like, what is grace, what is forgiveness, and how do I connect that to things that I'm going to do here as a land dweller up above?
Yeah. I'm thinking maybe we can transition to questions, but I actually would like you to give them a question or something to kind of chew on or discuss to start with. We're going to flip the script.
Yeah, so one of the questions I start with in class, and again, this is meant mostly for 18 to 22-year-olds, but is to ask them what kind of problems do they think environmental problems are, or ecological problems. And I give them 4 categories. I say, are they scientific problems? Are they economic problems? Are they political problems? Or are they moral/theological problems, right? So I say, you only get one category to pick: scientific problems, political problems, economic problems, or moral theological problems. So if I were to ask you that same question, what kind of problems do you think environmental problems are?
We'll give you a minute to think. Think of your own answer before you start looking at what other people say.
Can you give us the choices again?
Sure. Scientific problems, political problems, economic problems or moral/theological problems? Moral/ethical, however you want to frame that.
They are all four, right?
Well, I mean, if you want to vote all four, I'm not going to tell you how to vote. So we have one vote for all four.
In the wider context that you can teach us eventually.
I will get to what I say in a few minutes, but if you want to vote for all four, I'm not going to play. This is the game my students want to play. They like to psychoanalyze me and say, like, which way is he going to go? And the ones that have been with me a few years now think they can read my eyes. I teach outdoors now, and I wear sunglasses, so now it really freaks them out that they can't see my eyeballs when I'm asking these kind of questions. So we have one vote for all four. You had someone in the back, yeah. All four.
I was just going to say, I think it's moral and theological because that's where our values are set and they can gear us to every other topic.
Okay, we have one vote for moral and theological. What, in the back? Almost completely political. You agree with political? Okay. Any other votes? All four. I hear someone in the front. Okay, so this is where I get to play benevolent dictator and say which one is correct and which one is not. So most of the time, I get students who agree with one of the first three. Scientific problems, economic problems, or political. It's very rare, but occasionally I'll get a student who'll say it's a moral problem. And so again, maybe this is just my bias, but as I come at this as a professionally trained theologian, I think that most problems in life start as moral and or theological problems, but then they have scientific, political, or economic consequences, right? So the example I often give in class is something like, how do we know that clean air is good for us, or why should we have clean air? Why should we have clean water? Or why should we have nutritionally dense food? Seems like to me those are moral and theological questions we should be asking. Now, they're going to have pretty radical political consequences. They're going to have pretty radical economic consequences. They're going to have scientific consequences. But if we don't decide that everyone should have access to clean air or clean water or nutritionally dense food, it doesn't matter how much money that we spend on it. It doesn't matter what kind of taxation plan we have. It doesn't matter what political party you're part of. It doesn't matter what scientific procedures that we play into those things. And so for me, I try to convince Christians and ask Christians to think about these problems from that perspective. And hopefully to open up a different kind of avenue of thinking, because if we say everyone should breathe clean air, we'll just use that one for a second, I don't think anyone is going to suggest no. At least I have never been in a setting where someone's like, no, I'm anti-clean air. Like, we all think that we should have clean air. The question then gets into, well, how much are you willing to pay for it? You're willing to give up your car? You're willing to give up your plane travel? You're willing to invest in cleaner air technologies? You're willing to tax fossil fuel companies to keep what they're putting into the air, not into the air? There's a whole bunch of ramifications that come from that. There's a whole bunch of research that comes from it. All those things have major costs to them, but all those things have major benefits to it. We also know that the people that breathe cleaner air tend to live longer, healthier lives, tend to have less cancer, less heart disease, other things. So there's all these kind of benefits and these burdens. And then the other part that I teach about, at least in some of my classes on clean air, for example, is that communities of color tend to have dirtier air than white communities and tend to have higher rates of asthma and other respiratory diseases and have higher rates of cancer and other kinds of consequences that come from breathing dirty air. So we know that breathing clean air is something we'd all like, but it's not evenly portioned out in our society. Some people get access to it and some don't. But to me, the question of should we all have clean air is a deeply moral and hopefully a deeply Christian question that if Jesus was here with us today, when they didn't have fossil fuels back then to burn, they would say, yeah, of course we'd all want to breathe clean air. Now the question is, do we really want it enough to pay for it? Do we really want enough to vote for it? Do we really want enough to sacrifice some things maybe that we take seriously that would allow some other people to have access to clean air? How would we think about that? Those are all the other consequences. Those are the scientific, economic, and political consequences that come from it.
Yeah. And just to kind of tie back in some of the threads that you've already laid out, I think it's easy, it's tempting to say, well, I want to have clean air, and I'm just not going to think about other people who don't have clean air. But obviously, from a faith point of view, we can't we can't reconcile that, right? If we really believe that all people on this planet are made in the image of God, if we really believe what Jesus says, where he says, what you did to the least of these, you do to me, like if we really believe those things, we can't say, well, it's fine if people in India don't have clean air, because that's not going to affect me, which is a real daunting kind of thing to consider. Yeah. Do you want to take some questions from them?
Sure, I'd love to.
All right. What are you all thinking? I know we just gave you a lot to chew on. Yeah, go for it.
Climate anxiety is real, right? And for those of us who have really young kids or adult kids, I think we feel for what their future looks like. How do we keep from being hopeless?
Yeah, that's a great question.
And I'll just repeat it in case
Please
people
do.
couldn't hear. Danielle asked about climate anxiety, and I think the way you ended is really the poignant part. How do we keep from being hopeless? Yeah. Thanks, Chris.
So I'm kind of thinking I'll give you a couple of examples, sort of practically and I think theologically. We just had at Pepperdine 2 weeks ago hosted one of the leading researchers in the world on climate anxiety. It was a woman up at where's she at? Stanford. Up at Stanford, and she just wrote a book called Generation Dread, and it talks about climate anxiety, and in particular, she's a early 30s millennial. And she was talking about the arc of the book is sort of following her and her partner's choice to have a child or not, and looking at all the climate issues and saying, is it worth it to have a child? Is it fair to bring a child into the world knowing how bad things are going to get? And it's not a mystery novel. So at the end of the book, she says she does end up having a child. I met this little boy a couple weeks ago. But I think it was really fascinating because what her research group has shown is 16 to 25-year-olds. She just commissioned a study. It was 10,000 participants in 10 nations, 6 developed world nations, 4 developing world nations. And the age group was 16 to 25. The rates of climate anxiety were like we'd never expected. We expected them to be in developed world nations like the US and the UK and Australia, but found they were just as significant in Nigeria and Kenya and a few other developing world places that were part of this study. And I think one of the things that she found in this was a secondary question. This is not quite, I will get to your question directly in a second, but it was that Gen Z especially, so 16 to 25-year-olds being Generation Z, find a high level of betrayal by the government on climate issues, and that tends to make them feel even more anxious, that the leaders who are supposed to be doing something about this are not doing something, and that word betrayal came up, and it was in that research group. So one of the things we talked about in my class, and then her name is Britt Ray, Dr. Britt Ray, and one of the things that we talked about when Ray came down was some of the practical stuff. She runs a blog on top of doing her own research. And one of the things that she says in the blog is to validate people who are saying this, because climate anxiety is not a pathology. It's not the same as a general anxiety disorder. But it seems to be a response to basically getting bad news every single day of your life since you were like 5 or 6 years old, right? We're already starting to see children as young as 7 or 8 having PTSD nightmares based on climate issues. And I'm not a parent, so I don't want to say it's the parent's fault on that or get into that, but to say that is real, that those kinds of things are happening all over the globe. And so the first thing that Ray said, and we talked with my class about, was validating their feelings by saying, yeah, it is real. The consequences of climate change are felt all around the world, and you thinking that your livelihood is going to be impacted by it is a real phenomenon. And saying you're a snowflake and you should just get over it and be resilient is not a helpful strategy in helping to get a person to a place of resilience. And so I think that's one of the first things that I would recommend is saying, yeah, it's real. Tell me more about it. Why do you feel the way you do? Because even just asking that simple question allows that person to say, you're treating me seriously, even though you're not in my age group, and I want to hear more about why you feel this way. The second study that Ray and her team did, it just came out a couple of days ago, the results of it was looking at how 16 to 25-year-olds are starting to look at job and their career ambitions and realizing most of the jobs that they want are going to be heavily impacted by climate issues, and them feeling even more hopeless looking at those and realizing where they want to go into work is impacted by climate issues, and they are also the same issues that the political leaders are not working on the way that they believe they should. That brings even more climate anxiety. Again, not a pathology, but as Ray would call it, a reasonable response to the data that we see. So those would be the practical things that I would start with. The third one would be, I don't know, maybe I'm being straight. I don't know if that was 1, 2, or 3. Sorry about that. But the other one that I do with my students that, trained as a pastor, we probably should have PhDs in psychology before we get into the pastoral sphere, but I just sort of figure the Holy Spirit is somehow giving us some kind of guidance in this area. What psychologists say is to help young people find groups of like-minded people to talk about these things, because the anxiety comes down a bunch when they're able to talk with people who not just validate them, but are like-minded. And so what I told the pastoral training group that I was with a few years ago with you, not so much because we weren't talking about this topic, but with the one that Jenny was helping run a few weeks ago, was kids that age are going to find a group of people. Why not find a group of Christians to talk to? The problem is too many Christians don't want to talk about this. Too many Christians, Protestant Americans, Christians especially, think that this is not an issue. We score so low on just thinking that climate change is real compared to other denominations and compared to the general population, especially the non-Christian part of America. And so to me, my response is, if your church is not talking about this, then how do you think someone from age 6 to 25 is going to feel like they have like-minded people in their life to talk to about this? They're going to find a group of people. It just may not be the supportive group that you want. It may be supportive in this area, and it may be completely destructive in another area. And that would be my concern, as I see with my students as they've left churches, is they're finding the people to talk to, but they're not Christians. And not saying that there's non-Christian people are bad people, but they're not necessarily answering those questions in ways that I would want to sort of be answered in a way that I would think would be sort of mutually sort of uplifting and beneficial. So then theologically, how do I not remain hopeless? One of the things I write about in the book is that it must have been really difficult, and I don't even think we give the disciples enough credit. Could you imagine following this Jesus guy around for 3 years, thinking whatever you were thinking, because they obviously were not thinking the same things Jesus were thinking, because Jesus is nailed to a cross and dies, and they are likely thinking the Roman Empire has won again. Mm-hmm. And what kind of existential dread it must have been when that happened. You saw him literally nailed to the cross, and you think, I just gave my life to this guy, and the Roman Empire won again. I think a lot of my students are in that kind of existential thing, where they've grown up in a society that says, youth, just wait until your turn, and all of us old people are living longer and healthier lives. If we're in the U.S., we're holding on to our wealth longer, we're staying in positions of power longer. I'm a Gen Xer. I think my generation is getting really screwed because we can't get into seats of power because 80-year-olds are living longer, healthier lives, and holding on to more of their wealth. I'm great. My grandmother's 90. I'm glad she's still alive. But holding on to all the seats of power is leaving my generation, I think, sort of disenfranchised. And then millennials and Gen Zers can't seem to find a way to get into it because they don't have the income to get into seats of power. So I said, what would it look like to see yourself in the disciples and to know that happened? What I can't get my students to do because they've given up on Christianity is take what Easter Sunday talks about, is to see the light in the darkness and to know that there's something 3 days later. Because what would it have been like for the disciples to understand 3 days later? Because remember, some of them didn't believe it 3 days later because they were told a story by women or they were told a story that they just couldn't understand. And I think my students are dealing, and 16 to 25-year-olds in general, in Ray's study, are dealing with that kind of angst of it just does not ever seem to go away. The bad news always seems to be coming. And where do I go for any respite? And if houses of worship and faith communities are not going to be, as I call them in my book, beacons of hope, then we should just get out of the business of being Christian. Because if we are not going to take the world's greatest problem seriously, then where were these people going to go? And so that was a long-winded answer to your question, but that's how I deal with that. And I challenge my own church, my own individual home congregation, which has been a 15-year kind of struggle. But to say, if we are not going to be the places that talk about things that young people are talking about, of course they're going to go somewhere else. Mm-hmm. I mean, like, why wouldn't they? They'd be stupid not to. And I think that fear that a lot of us have in American Protestant settings is dictating this side of the resurrection rather than the side that we're supposedly living on, which is the place of no fear, the place of courage, the place of hope, the place of meaning. And I think I want to live on that side of things, not on the darkness side of Good Friday.
Yeah, if I can chime in on that, I already outed myself this morning as a millennial. I'm not sure if they had noticed, but I feel the climate anxiety. I really deeply do. And I think many people probably do, regardless of your age. And there are times where I feel hopeless, and there are times where I really don't know what to do about it. But two approaches, two perspectives that at least for me have been helpful, and take them or leave them. And one is more serious theological, and the other is a little more like internet meme-y. But on the more serious theological side, I was talking to John recently about Kierkegaard, and I love Kierkegaard. He's a great theologian. He has a book called Sickness Unto Death, and I'll spoil it for you right now. In that book, the sickness unto death, the problem, is despair. For Kierkegaard, the sickness unto death is despair. Despair is the thing that leads to death. And then he writes a second book, Practicing Christianity, where he basically gives the solution to that problem. And so for Kierkegaard, the solution to despair is faith. And we could have a whole separate lecture on what faith means to Kierkegaard, but I think it really ties in with what you're saying about sources of hope, right? Hope at a certain level is supremely irrational, right? It is irrational. The resurrection is irrational, right? Jesus was dead. And so to hope in the resurrection is like a wild thing to do. But that is kind of the antidote to despair. And I think that's something that we could be talking more about in the conversation about climate anxiety. And then my second approach, which is when I'm feeling maybe a little saltier, is honestly, spite is a really good survival tool. And there are people who will point out that despair is easy, right? It's easy to give up because it doesn't require you to do anything. And that actually hope is hard work, because if you have hope, then that actually means you can and should do something. And so there's a part of me that sometimes feels like, well, if the destructive forces in creation want me to give up, well, forget that. I'm not going to give up. I'm not going to give in to despair. And so that kind of spiteful energy sometimes keeps me going. So that's a more serious and a less serious approach. And I use both of those levers depending on the particular day.
Let me just say real quick, the climate anxiety research does not say that just 16 to 25-year-olds have this, but it tends to be more pronounced in that. We're starting to see some anecdotal research, at least, of grandparents saying, I'm worried about grandchild X in my family not being able to see the same lake that I was able to live with all my life, or not go down to the stream the same way, or ski on the same mountains. So it is across the spectrum. It just tends to be kind of hyper-focused on Gen Zers because they're the ones that are saying it more loudly than most other generations right now. Some psychological professional societies in the UK and the US are now starting to recognize it as, again, not a pathology, not in the sense of a chemical imbalance in the brain, but as a sense of an existential response to something they're seeing. And so there's starting to be this whole field called climate-aware therapists, and particularly working in group settings. And so some of my students have even gone to Zoom therapy sessions where they're in groups, and just talking about it, they said, is really fascinating. They don't need anyone to tell them what to do. They just need, they, being the 16 to 25-year-olds, just want older people to say, it's real. Mm-hmm. And yeah, we feel betrayed too, or yeah, we should be doing something differently too. And that tends to make a whole world of difference. Hopefully people are not fooling them. They're saying it honestly, that yeah, these things are happening. But I find that to be, hopefully, again, I'm not a parent or a grandparent, but I would hope that that would be encouraging to older people who are coming at this issue for the first time, to say, you trust your kids on a lot of other issues, that they come to you and you say, oh, that seems kind of wild. And maybe this is one that does, but maybe you say, yeah, tell me a little bit more about it. Like, why are you feeling the way that you're feeling? And why do so many of your peers feel this way? And what does it mean to you as a grandchild?
Yeah. Jen.
Chicken or the egg? Was it climate change or which divisions? Which came first, But I think it goes deeper than that when you talk about these generational differences. My family, for example, my 80-year-old dad lives in Tennessee, and they don't even recycle in their town. Like, it's not required. And so there's this fundamental disconnect. When I say recycling, it means something so different to me and my child who lives, Jackson will go to North Carolina. It's like, they're leaving the hose running. I'm like, they can. It feels different for them, and we recognize that. I guess I'm curious, as Christians, what can we do, or do you have thoughts on how we witness to one another within the lens of climate anxiety and climate change?
Ooh. How do we witness to each other within faith communities?
Yeah, witnessing is a great way of putting it, because I think using Christian language is really important for us, that we need to speak in the language that is common to us. And I will come back to your question in just a moment, but it's so fascinating, because now as I get into more of the Gen Zers, even the ones who claim that they were raised in a church, I'll say, oh, such and such story in the Gospel of Luke, and they're like, yeah, they're shaking their heads. And then I realize, like, halfway into like my conversation about it, they have no idea what I'm talking about. So there is Christian language that we need to not only use, but we're going to have to define more clearly for our, not just non-Christian audiences, but probably even for some of our children and grandchildren who are just going to nod their heads but not know what that is. So there's some basic witnessing that I think we should do. Catherine Hayhoe is a climate scientist and also a very devout Christian and a good friend of mine. She's one of the leading climate scientists in the world. And one of the best, you can, her site is weirding.com, and she's been on a number of things. She's on the UN's climate report. Anyway, devout Christian. She says something that I've just sort of taken seriously after knowing her and I, knowing each other for 7 or 8 years now. If we're not talking about this, then we don't think it's important, because we talk about things that are important all the time, whether they're small things or big things. Just whatever you talk about in church, you talk about at home, you talk about at your dinner table, you talk about on Facebook or social media or whatever, whether it's trivial or not, it's something you care about. And if you're not talking about climate change and its impacts on humans, or like in a climate anxiety way, or in the diving world or oceans or whatever, then you don't think it's important. And I think that's something that Catherine and I have wrestled with for a number of years, and the more I say that to students, again, that's the age group that I work with the most, the more that resonates with them, because they're talking about stuff that they find important all the time, but they're not hearing us as older adults talk about the same stuff. So if we think it's important, then we should be talking about it all the time. Now, witnessing also comes with discouragement, right? Because we could be talking about something that we find important, and someone in our community or someone just on the outside of our community could make fun of us or discourage us or do other things to bring us down because we're witnessing to something that we think is important. But that's what comes along with being a Christian at times, is saying the really important things in life and not necessarily getting a really warm response. So that would be on the first hand, I would say that. Is like, what are you talking about on a daily basis? And if you're not talking about climate issues on a daily basis, then it's probably not important to you yet. Okay? That doesn't mean it can't be, but it probably at this moment is not. The other thing would be on the witnessing, I tend to ask students to be very local. Like, I don't know where you grew. I've only been to North Carolina once, so I don't know a lot of what's going on there. I can read about floods and hurricanes and outer banks being wiped away by sea level rise, et cetera. But what I ask students is to like be hyper local about this. So what is climate change doing to impact, like where you go skiing every winter, where you go wakeboarding in the summer? If you're from Nevada, what's it doing there? If you're from this part of I grew up in Northern California, so like I know what happened there. Now I've lived almost half my life in Southern California. I think that's a really powerful way to witness, is to be as hyper local about it as possible and ask, what are water issues here? Is it too much or too little? You know, where's my food coming from? Is it coming from far away? Is it not far away? And those are another way to do it. Another way to do it is to think about, I have 1,001 examples of churches. You know, how do you use this place? This place of this building, this place of this campus, this place of your acreage. Is it used in a way that is suggesting what you find important? I think I'm seeing solar panels over there out the window. You know, so like that's something that in some church traditions, they've actually had on Earth Day, which was yesterday, sacred like readings of scripture talking about their solar panel usage. Or they've talked about how they've transitioned from using grape juice that was non-organic to organic grape juice so that they would not harm mostly brown-skinned people in the fields that would be picking grapes and be exposed to pesticides. So I think using the witnessing of our own actions is going to be really profound in ways that some churches are going to be able to put up solar panels and others are not. My particular home congregation does not have a physical building that we own, so we can't do that, but we can do other sorts of things. So I would say, you know, that's where this hyper-locality kind of comes in and starts saying, like, what do we do, okay? And then the other witness one is, again, usually makes me pretty unpopular. The one that we can all do is look at what we eat. What we eat has major climate impacts and is more controllable usually than what we can drive. Because most of us can't usually control how far we drive to work, how far we have to go to see my grandmother lives on a farm in the middle of Arkansas. I can't get her to come to California and retire here, so she's a 90-year-old that lives by herself in the middle of nowhere. I can't control that, so I have to go fly to see her, right? But I can think about daily, what do I eat? What that's doing to me as a Christian, how that connects to my understanding of the Eucharist. So to me, being very local about thinking through what is impacting me, I think is what I would offer in that way.
Yeah, please.
The one thing that's churning around in my head is this Colorado River issue here locally we talk about. The notion that, you know, three states are draining that river is terrifying to me. And I'm thinking, do I sell my house and move somewhere where there's more water? You know, how real is that threat?
Yeah.
That story. It feels like it's going to come crashing down very quickly. Like in October, they're going to make decisions about this. The water rights. What are we doing?
Yeah, so Brian is asking about the Colorado River issue and like water rights and water access.
Here in California.
Yeah.
Southern California, we're going to have water forever. I just
Right.
Don't know that.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a great question. I was teaching a couple of days ago, and we were reading some articles about this in one of my upper division climate change classes, and someone had gone to the bathroom after break, came back and said, oh, I just ran into someone giving a tour of campus, and the tour guide said, oh, don't worry, the drought is over. We don't have to worry about all this water conservation stuff. And the student said, Dr. Doran, is that right? And I looked at her and I said, what do you think? And she goes, no. And I said, no, it's absolutely wrong, and I don't have to be a biologist to know that. So the Colorado River thing, I know a few farmers in the area that I talked to about this, you know, and there's a bunch of layers, so let me just kind of unpack just a wee bit, but I can't speak to all of them. The water rights issue in California goes back to the 1800s and our relationship with those other 6 states, the 7 states that the federal government was asked to change the way they apportioned the Colorado River, goes back in some places the 1800s and others the 1900s. So the 3 biggest problems are California, LA, Southern California is where we draw this. So my students keep saying, well, we just got all this rain. And I said, yeah, we did, But Southern California gets most of its water from the Colorado River. It does not get most of its water from the snowpack that is in Northern California. And the other part of Southern California is the problem is we've been siphoning off so much of that water and growing food in basically the deserts of Imperial Valley and the parts of the Central Valley, and then turning that food mostly into animal feed to go to cows mostly. And so feeding animals food out of the desert that we don't have to eat on the regular basis that we do changes the equation of how much water we take. And the other two big metropoli, other than LA, that are a problem is Vegas and Phoenix. Those two cities never were expected to get that big, and now, Phoenix, I think, is the third or fourth largest metropolitan area in the country. And people continue to move there, and the farms in northern part of Arizona continue to lose water because it comes to California rather than not. So that's all to say, I don't know if you should move or not, because, I don't know what your particular situation is, but living here, I'll tell you what I told my students. The fact that the governor of California and some of the local water officials will say the drought is over and we can just go back to living the way we were, it seems a repeat of the foolishness that humans have, that we're very short-term thinking creatures, but we love to believe that we're long-term planners. And I think that's, part of the Adam and Eve story, right? It's like how short-termed Adam and Eve were, it's like, it's a repetition of who we are. So again, I live in what's called unincorporated LA County. I live on the Pepperdine campus, but we're not technically in Malibu. We import 100% of our water. Pepperdine reclaims about 99.9% of its water through a water reclamation program. We have 0 water conservation measures in place, except for turning off a few fountains that were spraying water in the air, and I and some other people raised righteous holy hell about. This is just a part of who we are. We are stupid human creatures at times when we need to be really brilliant, and we have all the technology in place. We just don't tend to always have the social and political will to be the kind of people that we should be. And so we were coming out of this drought in the sense of we have a snowpack that is way above average, and we will probably make it through the rest of this year, skating through just fine. But on average, it takes 3 years for water to seep through the ground back into the aquifers. And we know we lost 70% of that water to the ocean because we don't have good infrastructure in place to try to recharge those aquifers as quickly as possible other than through just ground soaking. So, there's a lot of pieces to your question, and all I can tell you is wealthy people in Southern California are starting to buy land. Pennsylvania, Minnesota, New Hampshire, Vermont, those are some big places. People that are uber wealthy are buying places in Canada because there's plenty of water in Canada. This is where you're seeing wealth is find places in the world that are going to have water. And so, as a former biologist, this is the worst drought in about 1,200 years in California or in the Southwest region. The last time we had a drought of this sort, it was 40 or 50 years by tree ring evidence. There is no reason to think just one winter's rain is going to fix our problems, and we wouldn't even know for another 3 years how much our aquifers are going to be recharged.
Yeah.
So sorry to give such a devastatingly despairing answer to that, but I think that's kind of where we're at these days.
On a global scale, the water refugee issue is a real thing.
Yep.
There are places that are drying up.
Yeah, Chris, can you share the name of that documentary that we watched about the climate refugees?
Yes.
I know
Trying
I
to
put
think
you on
which
the
one.
spot.
Yeah. Oh, yes. It's called Sun Come Up.
Sun Come Up.
It's about climate refugees in Carteret Islands, which is a set of islands off of Papua New Guinea. They only have about 1,000 people, and it's taken 10 years, and they've only moved about a few hundred people off. But the research I'm doing right now is, that number is actually, probably by the end of the century, there'll be about 2 billion people on the move due to climate issues. And water is just part of it. It's expanding deserts and sea level rise are the two major pieces of it. So if you think about what 2 billion is, that's roughly this, India and China picking up and moving at the same time. Now, does that mean they move outside their nation states? Not necessarily, but we have never had, a few 100 million people on the planet moving at the same time. To think that by the end of the century, we'd have 2 billion people on the move trying to find places to live is something that human history has never had before. And we basically inhabit all of the habitable land on the planet. It's not like it was 40 or 50,000 years ago when you could just kind of roam different continents. Basically, all the arable land is taken, and basically all the habitable land is taken. So how are we going to decide to live with others who are going to have places to live? And the continents of Africa and Asia will be the most impacted by this because they are pretty equatorial, and more people live near the equator than live in North America or some other places in the global north.
Yeah, if you can look up this documentary, Sun Come Up, they're on these tiny islands and the ocean is rising, and so their small amount of land where they grow, it's inundated with seawater. They can't grow food anymore. And so some of their young people literally pick up and go to Papua New Guinea and ask strangers, for those of you who are listening to my sermon this morning, can you give us a place to live? And it's so heart-wrenching and beautiful at the same time, just seeing these conversations that they're having where they're literally going from town to town and saying, will you help us? And I think it's easy for us from a place of relatively a lot of privilege. We're not having those kind of conversations yet. But what would you do if somebody literally came to your door and said, my home is gone, will you help me? We like to think, well, of course we would. That's the Christian thing to do, but really, that's the question that we're going to be facing. So, yes, please, and then I'll come to you. Go ahead.
Oh, is that me?
Yeah.
Okay. Artificial intelligence and emerging fusion technologies, are they a cure-all, or what are the dark sides of those related to climate change?
So what are the questions about AI and other emergent intelligent questions? There's so many ways to go about this. I'm dealing with students who are using ChatGPT to cheat right now. Not me personally, but I'm the faculty president right now, so we're dealing with this at a massive level. It's easy to say AI is only cheating and kind of getting away with trouble. We know on the energy sector, for example, AI has been very helpful in creating what we call smart grids, which is electric grids that are drawing off one place and drawing off another and then pushing it to another place. And AI does a much better and quicker job at doing all those calculations than humans do, and even human-generated algorithms for that. And so we know in places like Texas and others who have pretty complicated energy systems based on wind and other renewables, even though the governor of Texas doesn't like to admit that, they're leading the country in wind energy. And they're using AI to help push that energy to the places it needs, And so AI, it seems like, is going to not just be here to stay. We just don't know what form it's going to be, but has incredible, it looks like, benefits for the energy sector in particular. As for other sectors, I couldn't say. I know of some interesting kinds of uses of robotics in the farm sector, like creating little drones, like little tanks that kind of go around and try to spray weeds one at a time and use AI to take pictures and figure out which plants are the ones to go after or not. Those are in the very infancy stages. I've been teaching a class on that this semester. And very infant stages of that, but it wouldn't surprise me if that's something that we see in the future. So whether you call that robotics or AI, but some kind of mechanized force to help with that. And that has some interesting benefits, right? Like applying less pesticides is good for us all, not just the people in the fields, but us as well and the land itself. So those are the two sectors that I know a little tiny bit about. I wouldn't want to speak past that point.
Thanks.
That documentary, is that Netflix or where?
Oh, I don't know where you find it.
I will find it, Jenny, and
Great.
And get you the link, and then
We'll
and then
put it
figure
in
out.
e-week. We'll get that information out. Awesome.
Yeah.
I know we are at 2:37. We've kind of gone past our hour, but I want to thank you again, Chris, for being here, and I want to thank all of you for being here. Chris said, if your church isn't talking about these things, that's really the first step. Well, we're talking about it, so good job. First step. Thank you so much. Thank you, Chris. And if Chris doesn't mind sticking around for a few more minutes, if there were any lingering questions you want to come chat, please do. Thank you so much.